My son laughed when I sold my grandmother's jewelry to survive. But he stopped laughing when he saw what I did with every last penny of my inheritance. What happened next left my entire family in absolute shock. I'm grateful you're here with me today. Stay until the end of this story, and please comment which country you're watching from so I can see how far my message has reached. At 70 years old, I never imagined my own son would betray me the way he did. But standing in my modest living room that cold February afternoon, watching him smirk as I signed away my future, I realized that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most can become your worst enemies. My name is Eleanor Whitfield, and for most of my life, I believed I'd done everything right as a mother. I raised my son, Brandon, as a single parent after my husband Marcus died from a sudden heart attack when Brandon was only 11 years old. Those were the darkest years of my life, years filled with grief, financial struggle, and the overwhelming weight of being solely responsible for a child who just lost his father. I worked as a registered nurse at Mercy General Hospital in Seattle, Washington. The shifts were long and exhausting, often stretching into 12 or 14 hours when we were understaffed. I remember coming home at midnight, my feet aching, my back screaming, only to help Brandon with his homework or pack his lunch for the next day. There were countless nights when I skipped dinner entirely because there simply wasn't enough food for both of us, and I would lie to my son, telling him I'd eaten at the hospital. I gave up everything for Brandon. After Marcus died, several men showed interest in me over the years. There was Robert, a kind accountant from my church who asked me to dinner multiple times. There was James, a widower I met at a grief support group who seemed to understand my pain. But I always said no. I told myself that Brandon needed all my attention, that bringing another man into our lives would complicate things, that my son deserved a mother who was fully focused on his well-being. Looking back now, I wonder if I made a mistake. Not because I needed a man, but because maybe I taught Brandon that my needs didn't matter. That mothers were supposed to sacrifice everything without expecting anything in return. Brandon grew up into a handsome, intelligent young man. He excelled in school, got into Seattle University on a partial scholarship that I supplemented with every spare dollar I could scrape together, and eventually became a real estate attorney. I was so incredibly proud of him. All those years of sacrifice had paid off, or so I thought. When Brandon was 28, he married a lovely young woman named Rachel Chin. She was a pediatric nurse, kind and warm, with a gentle laugh that reminded me of wind chimes. Rachel and I became close over the years. We'd meet for coffee on Sunday mornings, share recipes, and talk about everything from work stress to our hopes for Brandon's future. She was the daughter I'd never had. 2 years into their marriage, they gave me the most precious gift imaginable, my grandson, Oliver. That little boy became the light of my life. I would babysit every chance I got, watching him grow from a chubby, giggling baby into a curious, bright-eyed child. Oliver called me Nana, and the sound of his voice saying that word could melt away any bad day. For 23 years, I watched Brandon build what appeared to be a perfect life. He and Rachel bought a beautiful house in the Bellevue neighborhood, with a big backyard where Oliver could play. Brandon's law practice flourished. They took family vacations to places I'd only dreamed of visiting. From the outside, everything looked ideal. But then, about 4 years ago, I started noticing cracks in the facade. It began with small things that I tried to dismiss. Brandon's visits became less frequent. When he did stop by my small apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, he seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone, his fingers flying across the screen with text messages he'd angle away from my view. His eyes had a distant quality, like he was physically present but mentally somewhere else entirely. Rachel stopped coming to our Sunday coffee dates. The first few times, she had legitimate excuses. She'd picked up an extra shift, Oliver had a soccer game, she wasn't feeling well. But as the cancellations continued, I could hear something strained in her voice when I called. Something sad and defeated. Is everything all right between you and Brandon? I finally asked her one Sunday when she actually showed up, looking thinner and more tired than I'd ever seen her. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly. We're just going through a rough patch, Eleanor. All marriages have them, right? I wanted to press further, to demand the truth, but she changed the subject and I let her. I wish now that I hadn't. 3.5 years ago, Brandon told me he wanted to have a serious conversation. He came to my apartment on a Wednesday evening, his suit immaculate, his expression carefully neutral. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Rachel and I are separating," he announced, sitting on the edge of my old floral sofa like he was afraid it might soil his expensive clothes. "We've grown apart." "It happens." "Grown apart?" I repeated, shocked. "Brandon, you have a son together. You've been married for over 20 years. You don't just throw that away because you've grown apart." His jaw tightened. "I didn't come here for a lecture, Mom. I came to inform you of my decision. Rachel and I have already agreed to divorce terms. It's going to be amicable." "Does Oliver know?" "We're telling him this weekend." Brandon stood up, clearly ready to end this conversation. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't interfere or try to talk me out of this. My mind is made up." I watched my son walk toward the door, and I barely recognized him. Where was the sensitive boy who used to cry at sad movies? Where was the young man who'd written such beautiful vows at his wedding, promising to love Rachel through every challenge life might bring? "Is there someone else?" I asked quietly. Brandon paused with his hand on the doorknob. For a moment, I thought he might deny it. Instead, he simply said, "That's not relevant," and left. I called Rachel immediately, but she didn't answer. When I finally reached her 2 days later, she sounded hollow, defeated. "There is someone else," she confirmed. "Her name is Sienna. She works at his firm. She's 31 years old, Eleanor." 31. Brandon is 51. My heart broke for her, and for Oliver, and for the family that was being torn apart. The divorce proceedings dragged on for 8 months. Brandon, despite his promises of an amicable split, fought Rachel on every detail. He hired an aggressive attorney who painted Rachel as an overspending, negligent mother, which was absolutely absurd to anyone who actually knew her. In the end, Rachel got the house but had to buy out Brandon's share, leaving her financially strained. Brandon got generous visitation rights that he barely used. Then, about 18 months ago, I finally met her. Sienna Blackwood. Brandon brought her to my apartment for Sunday brunch without any warning. I opened my door expecting just my son, and instead found him standing there with a woman who looked young enough to be his daughter. Sienna was undeniably beautiful in that carefully constructed way that requires money and effort. Her honey blonde hair fell in perfect waves past her shoulders. Her skin was flawless, likely aided by expensive treatments and procedures. She wore skin-tight designer jeans, a silk blouse that probably cost more than my weekly paycheck, and heels so high I couldn't imagine walking in them for more than 5 minutes. "Mom, this is Sienna," Brandon said, his hand possessively on her lower back. "Sienna, this is my mother, Eleanor." "It's so wonderful to finally meet you," Sienna said, her voice high and sweet like artificial sugar. She stepped into my apartment, and I watched her eyes sweep across my modest living space, the old furniture I'd had for 20 years, the worn carpet, the small kitchen visible from the living room, the family photos on the walls in mismatched frames. "What a quaint place," she said, and though her smile never faltered, I could see the judgment in her eyes. "Brandon has told me so much about his childhood. It must have been so difficult, raising him alone in such limited circumstances." The way she emphasized limited made it clear she wasn't offering sympathy. She was establishing a hierarchy, reminding me that she came from money and I didn't. I served the brunch I'd prepared, nothing fancy, just scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, and fresh fruit, and watched as Sienna pushed food around her plate, taking bird-sized bites while monopolizing the conversation. She talked about her yoga retreats in Bali, her shopping trips to Paris, her family's vacation home in the San Juan Islands. Every story was designed to showcase her wealth and sophistication. "Brandon is going to take me to the Maldives next month," she announced, reaching over to squeeze my son's hand. "First-class flights, overwater bungalow, the works. He's been working so hard, he deserves a proper vacation." I thought about Rachel, who was working double shifts to afford the mortgage on a house she'd lived in for 20 years. I thought about Oliver, now 21 and in his junior year at University of Washington, taking out student loans because his father claimed he couldn't afford to help with tuition after the expensive divorce. That sounds lovely, I said carefully. I hope Oliver gets to spend some time with you before you leave, Brandon. He mentioned he hasn't seen you in over a month. Brandon's face tightened. Oliver is an adult now. He doesn't need me to babysit him. He's your son, I said quietly. And he's old enough to understand that adults have their own lives, Sienna interjected, her voice sharp despite her continued smile. Brandon shouldn't have to feel guilty about being happy just because his son is needy. I bit back the response I wanted to give. This was my home, but Brandon was my son, and I'd learned over the past year that criticizing Sienna was the fastest way to ensure I wouldn't see him at all. Over the following months, I watched Sienna's influence over Brandon grow stronger. My son, who'd once been thoughtful and generous, became increasingly focused on money and status. He traded his reliable sedan for a Tesla. He moved from his comfortable condo into a luxury penthouse in downtown Seattle with panoramic views of Puget Sound. He started talking about investments and portfolio diversification and making smart money moves. And he stopped visiting me almost entirely. When he did call, it was brief and perfunctory. Just checking in, Mom. How are you? That's good. I've got to run to a meeting. Talk soon. Then weeks would pass before I'd hear from him again. Rachel told me that Brandon had also become erratic with Oliver. He'd promised to take his son to dinner, then cancel at the last minute because Sienna wanted to attend some social event. He'd commit to helping with something, then ghost completely. Oliver's hurt, Rachel confided during one of our resumed Sunday coffee dates. He doesn't say it, but I can see it. He's starting to pull away from Brandon entirely. I tried to bridge that gap. I made a point of taking Oliver to lunch every few weeks, of staying involved in his life even as his father drifted away. Oliver was studying business and economics at UW, and he'd talk to me about his classes, his friends, his hopes for the future. Those lunches became precious to me. But then, about 6 months ago, something changed with Oliver too. He started canceling our lunches. When we did meet up, he seemed distracted, checking his phone constantly, just like Brandon used to do. His attitude toward me shifted from warm and affectionate to something colder, more transactional. Nana, he said one day over lunch at our usual spot, a little cafe near the university, can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. Is it true you inherited a house from your great-aunt? My stomach clenched. Yes, my Aunt Cecilia passed away about 1.5 years ago. She left me her home in Olympia. Why do you ask? Oliver looked uncomfortable. Dad mentioned it. He said it's worth a lot of money. It's worth about $750,000, I confirmed carefully. It's a beautiful Victorian house that's been in our family for 3 generations. That's amazing, Nana. But Oliver's expression wasn't happy. He looked troubled, like he was working up to something. So, what are you going to do with it? I haven't decided yet, I said honestly. I've been thinking about selling it eventually and using the money for retirement. I'm 70 years old, Oliver. I can't work as a nurse forever. But you're still working now, right? Part-time? Yes, 3 days a week. I need the income to supplement my Social Security. Oliver nodded slowly. Dad says you're sitting on $750,000 while the family is struggling. I felt like I'd been slapped. Struggling? Oliver, your father drives a Tesla and lives in a penthouse that probably costs $5,000 a month. But the divorce cost him a lot, Oliver said, and I could hear Brandon's words coming out of my grandson's mouth. And I have all these student loans. Dad says if you sold the house, you could help me pay off my debt and still have plenty left for yourself. I stared at my grandson, this young man I'd babysat, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose bedtime stories I'd read 1,000 times, and I saw Brandon's influence written all over his face. Oliver, that house is my retirement security, I said gently. I worked for 50 years as a nurse. I raised your father alone. I sacrificed everything to give him opportunities. That house is the only valuable asset I've ever owned. I know, but... Oliver trailed off, looking miserable. Dad says family is supposed to help family. He says you're being selfish. The word selfish hit me like a physical blow. I'd given up my entire adult life for Brandon. I'd worked myself to exhaustion. I'd foregone relationships, hobbies, travel, any personal pleasures, all so my son could have a better life than I'd had. And now, through my grandson's mouth, he was calling me selfish for wanting to keep the one financial security I'd ever been given. That lunch ended awkwardly, with Oliver hurrying off to a study group and barely hugging me goodbye. Over the next few weeks, his texts became less frequent. His responses to my messages grew shorter and more distant. I knew Brandon was behind it. He was turning my grandson against me, poisoning him with the idea that I was hoarding money that rightfully belonged to the family. Then came the Sunday that changed everything. It was a gray February afternoon, typical for Seattle, with rain drumming against my windows and the sky hanging low and heavy. I wasn't expecting visitors, so when I heard a knock at my door, I was surprised. I opened it to find Brandon, Sienna, and Oliver standing in my hallway. My son wore one of his expensive suits, charcoal gray with a burgundy tie. Sienna was dressed in winter white, a cashmere sweater, tailored pants, and a coat that I recognized from a Nordstrom window display I'd walked past, priced at $1,200. Oliver stood slightly behind them, his hands shoved in his pockets, unable to meet my eyes. "Mom, we need to talk," Brandon said, his voice carrying that flat, professional tone he probably used with difficult clients. "May we come in?" I stepped aside, my heart already sinking. I knew what this was about. They filed into my small living room. Brandon and Sienna took the sofa, sitting close together, a united front. Oliver perched on the edge of my reading chair, still not looking at me. I sat in my other chair, my hands folded in my lap, waiting. "Mom," Brandon began, "we're here because we're concerned about your financial situation." "My financial situation is fine," I said carefully. Sienna let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "Eleanor, with all due respect, you're 70 years old and still working as a nurse. You live in a 700-square-foot apartment. You drive a 15-year-old Honda. That's not fine." I looked at my son. "Brandon, why is Sienna speaking for you?" "Because she's right," he said. "Mom, you're killing yourself working at your age when you're sitting on $750,000 in real estate. It doesn't make sense." "Aunt Cecilia left that house to me," I said slowly, as if explaining to a child. "It's my inheritance. My retirement plan." "And what are you planning to do with it?" Brandon leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Just keep paying property taxes and insurance on a house you're not even living in? That's thousands of dollars a year down the drain. I'm considering my options." "For a year and a half?" Brandon's voice rose slightly. "Mom, you need to be practical. That house should be sold and the money should be invested properly." "Invested?" I repeated. "You mean you want me to give you the money?" "Not give," Sienna interjected smoothly. "Invest. Brandon has connections with investment opportunities that could triple that money in 5 years. You'd still benefit, obviously. We'd make sure you were taken care of." There was that phrase again. Taken care of. Like I was a child or a pet, something to be managed rather than a person with my own agency. "I don't need to be taken care of," I said firmly. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own finances." "Are you though?" Sienna's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "Because from where I'm sitting, you're making emotional decisions instead of practical ones. That house is just bricks and mortar, Eleanor. It's not your aunt. Holding on to it out of sentimentality is costing you money every single day." I turned to Oliver, hoping to find an ally. "Oliver, what do you think about all this?" My grandson finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my heart break. There was guilt there, yes, but also something harder. Entitlement. Nana, I'm drowning in student debt, he said quietly. I owe almost $80,000. Dad's been helping where he can, but after the divorce and everything. He trailed off. If you could just help me pay off even half of it, it would change my life. I could actually start saving money, maybe buy a car that doesn't break down every month. Oliver, I've offered multiple times to help you with smaller amounts, I said gently. I sent you $500 just last month for books and expenses. $500 doesn't even cover 1 month's loan payment, Oliver shot back, and there was an edge to his voice I'd never heard before. You have $750,000, Nana. You could wipe out my entire debt and barely notice. But it wouldn't just be your debt, would it? I looked at Brandon. What else would you need money for? My son had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, but he didn't back down. I have business opportunities that require capital. Real estate investments that could provide passive income for all of us, including you. And yes, the divorce was expensive. Rachel's lawyers bled me dry, Mom. I'm rebuilding my financial foundation. By taking mine? I asked quietly. By utilizing family assets efficiently, Brandon corrected. Mom, that money is going to come to me eventually anyway when you... He paused delicately. When you pass. You're 70. You could have another good 20 years, but you could also have health issues tomorrow. Why not access that wealth now, when it can actually improve everyone's quality of life? The cruelty of that statement, the casual discussion of my mortality as a financial planning opportunity, left me momentarily speechless. Sienna, sensing an advantage, pressed forward. Eleanor, I know this feels overwhelming. But think about Oliver. Think about your grandson's future. Do you really want him starting his adult life buried under debt when you have the power to help him? What kind of grandmother would choose money over her grandson's well-being? The manipulation was so blatant, so calculated, that I felt anger begin to replace my shock. The kind of grandmother, I said slowly, who worked for 50 years to earn her own security. The kind of grandmother who raised a son alone on a nurse's salary. The kind of grandmother who gave up everything, every dream, every opportunity, every chance at personal happiness, so that son could have a better life. And we appreciate that, Mom, Brandon said quickly. But appreciation doesn't pay bills. Sentiment doesn't build wealth. I'm asking you to be practical. Practical, I repeated. You want me to sell the only valuable thing I've ever owned and hand the money to you so you can invest it? Tell me, Brandon, exactly how much would I see from these investments? What percentage of the profits would come back to me? Brandon and Sienna exchanged a glance. We'd have to look at the specific opportunities, Brandon said vaguely. But obviously you'd benefit. Obviously, I interrupted, I'd get whatever you decided to give me. If anything. This isn't about investing my money, Brandon. This is about taking it. That's not fair, Oliver spoke up. Dad's trying to help everyone, including you. Help me? I stared at my grandson. Oliver, I'm working 3 days a week at 70 years old because I need the money. Your father drives a $90,000 car and lives in a luxury penthouse. Who exactly needs help here? I need help. Oliver's voice cracked. I'm 21 years old and I already owe more money than I can possibly repay. Every month I fall further behind. Every month the interest adds up. Do you know what that feels like? To be buried under debt before your life has even really started? Yes, I said quietly. I do know what that feels like. I was $40,000 in debt after your grandfather died. Medical bills, funeral costs, the mortgage. I paid it off over 10 years by working double shifts and eating rice and beans for dinner. I know exactly what that feels like, Oliver. That was different. How? I challenged. How is it different? Because you didn't have a family member sitting on $750,000 who could have helped you. Oliver was standing now, his face flushed. You're being selfish, Nana. Dad's right. You're choosing money over family. The word selfish again. I wondered how many times Brandon had used that word, how thoroughly he'd poisoned my grandson against me. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting. At 70, I felt every year in my bones. I think you should all leave. Mom, Brandon started. Get out, I said more firmly. All of you. Brandon stood, straightening his jacket with sharp, angry movements. You're making a mistake. That money could change all our lives. It's my money, I said, my voice shaking with suppressed emotion. My aunt left it to me. Not to you. Not to Oliver. To me. Sienna stood as well, and the sympathetic mask she'd been wearing finally slipped. Her face hardened into something cold and calculating. This is exactly what Brandon warned me about, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. He said you'd be difficult. He said you've always been bitter about not having money, and now that you finally have some, you're clutching it like Gollum with his precious ring. The literary reference was meant to be insulting, but it was so absurdly dramatic that I almost laughed. Brandon warned you about me? I looked at my son. What exactly did you tell her? Brandon wouldn't meet my eyes. I just said that you've always been financially anxious. That you tend to make emotional decisions about money because you've never had any real financial education. Financial education, I repeated numbly. I managed to raise you, keep us housed and fed, and put you through college on a nurse's salary. But I lack financial education. That's not what I meant. Yes, it is. I walked to my front door and opened it. I want you to leave now. All of you. Oliver walked out first, his shoulders hunched. As he passed me, I reached out to touch his arm, but he pulled away. That small rejection hurt more than anything else that had been said. Sienna followed, pausing in the doorway. You're going to regret this, Eleanor. We're trying to help you, and you're too stubborn to see it. The only thing I regret, I said quietly, is not setting clearer boundaries years ago. Brandon was the last to leave. He stood in my doorway, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something in his face, maybe guilt, maybe doubt. But then Sienna called his name from the hallway, and his expression hardened again. I'm going to give you a week to think about this, Mom, he said. But after that, I'm going to stop being polite about it. That money should be benefiting your family, not sitting idle in a house no one's using. If you can't see that, then you're not the mother I thought you were. He left, and I closed the door behind him. I stood there in my small apartment, surrounded by the modest possessions of a life spent in service to others, and I let myself cry. Not just because of what had happened, but because of what I'd finally, clearly understood. My son didn't see me as his mother. He saw me as an obstacle between him and money he felt entitled to. My grandson, influenced by his father's poisonous entitlement, had learned to see me the same way. I had sacrificed 50 years of my life, and this was my reward. Being called selfish for wanting to keep what was rightfully mine. But as I dried my tears and looked around my small apartment, I felt something begin to shift inside me. Something hard and determined. That house in Olympia was mine. The money from selling it would be mine. And I was done letting other people tell me what to do with my life. If Brandon thought he could pressure me into handing over my inheritance, he had seriously underestimated his mother. I walked to my desk and pulled out the folder containing all the information about Aunt Cecilia's house. Property appraisals, tax documents, the will that clearly stated the house was mine and mine alone. Then I did something I'd been avoiding for over a year. I called a real estate agent in Olympia. Hello, this is Eleanor Whitfield, I said when she answered. I have a Victorian property I'd like to put on the market. How soon can we meet? The agent sounded delighted. Victorian homes in Olympia are incredibly desirable right now. Based on the address you're giving me, I think we could list it for $780,000, possibly more. When would you like to come see me? As soon as possible, I said. After I hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time, thinking. Brandon expected me to cave to his pressure. He expected me to feel guilty enough about Oliver's debt and his own struggles that I'd hand over my inheritance like a dutiful mother should. He had no idea what I was actually planning to do. But he was going to find out very soon. The week following that confrontation was one of the loneliest of my life. My phone, which usually chimed with at least a few messages from Oliver or the occasional call from Brandon, remained almost entirely silent. The silence felt deliberate, calculated, a punishment for not complying with their demands. I threw myself into work at Mercy General, picking up an extra shift even though my body protested. At 70, 12-hour shifts on a hospital floor were grueling. My feet swelled in my nursing shoes, my lower back ached constantly, and by the end of each day, I was so exhausted I could barely make dinner before collapsing into bed. But work was a distraction from the hurt. When I was checking vitals, administering medications, and comforting frightened patients, I didn't have time to think about how my own son had looked at me with such cold calculation, or how my grandson had called me selfish. My colleague, Patricia, noticed something was wrong. She was 58, a veteran nurse who'd worked at Mercy General for 30 years, and we become close friends over the past decade. "Eleanor, you've been quiet all week," she said during our lunch break on Thursday. We were sitting in the hospital cafeteria, picking at wilted salads and drinking bitter coffee. "Want to talk about it?" I found myself telling her everything. The inheritance, Brandon's demands, the confrontation, Oliver's debt, Sienna's manipulations. Patricia listened without interrupting, her face growing more outraged with each detail. "Let me get this straight," she said when I finished. "Your son, who's a successful attorney, who drives a Tesla and lives in a luxury penthouse, is demanding that you, a 70-year-old woman still working as a nurse, hand over your entire inheritance so he can invest it? That's the basic summary, yes. Eleanor, that's financial elder abuse. You know that, right? We see it in patients all the time. Family members pressuring elderly relatives to sign over property or money." I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but hearing Patricia say it made something click into place. "I suppose it is," I said quietly. "What are you going to do?" I smiled, and there must have been something fierce in my expression because Patricia's eyebrows rose. "I'm selling the house," I said. "I met with a real estate agent in Olympia yesterday. We're listing it for $780,000. "Good for you," Patricia said firmly. "And then what? You're going to give Brandon the money anyway?" "Absolutely not." My smile widened. "I'm going to do something I've never done in my entire life. I'm going to be selfish." Patricia laughed, the sound echoing across the cafeteria. "I love it. What are you planning?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But it's going to be something for me. Something I want. Something that has nothing to do with being a mother or a grandmother or fulfilling anyone else's expectations." "You should travel," Patricia suggested, her eyes lighting up. "You've never been anywhere, Eleanor. You've spent your whole life in Seattle working and raising Brandon. Take the money and see the world." The idea settled into my mind like a seed finding fertile soil. Travel. The world. Places I'd only seen in magazines and travel shows, places I'd dreamed about but never thought I'd actually visit. "I might just do that," I said softly. But I didn't get the chance to think about it much further. That evening, when I returned home from my shift, exhausted and ready for a hot bath and an early bedtime, I found Brandon waiting outside my apartment building. He was leaning against his Tesla, arms crossed, his face set in grim determination. When he saw me approaching, he pushed off the car and walked toward me. "Mom, we need to talk." "I thought I made myself clear last Sunday," I said, fumbling for my keys. "I don't want to discuss this anymore." "Too bad, because we're going to discuss it." Brandon followed me into the building, up the stairs to my second-floor apartment. "You can't just shut me out, Mom. I'm your son. And this is my home, and you're not invited inside." I turned to face him in the hallway outside my door. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it right here." Brandon's jaw clenched. He glanced around the hallway, dingy carpet, fluorescent lights, the faint smell of someone's cooking drifting from another apartment, and I could see the distaste in his expression. "Fine," he said. "I heard you met with a real estate agent in Olympia." My stomach dropped. How did he know that? I'd been careful, discreet. Then I realized, the agent must have run a title search or pulled property records, standard procedure before listing a house. Brandon, as a real estate attorney, probably had alerts set up on Aunt Cecilia's property. "That's none of your business," I said. "It is my business when you're about to make a massive financial mistake," Brandon shot back. "Mom, if you sell that house without proper planning, without proper investment strategy, you're going to lose half of it to taxes and fees. Let me help you structure this properly." "Structure it properly," I repeated. "You mean structure it so you get access to the money?" "I mean structure it so you don't get taken advantage of by predatory financial advisors or real estate agents who just want their commission." Brandon softened his tone, trying a different approach. "Mom, I'm an attorney. I deal with real estate transactions every day. I can protect you from making mistakes." "The only person I need protection from is you," I said quietly. Brandon's face flushed with anger. "That's incredibly unfair. I'm trying to help you, and you're treating me like some kind of villain. You came to my home with your mistress and my grandson and demanded I hand over my inheritance. You called me selfish for wanting to keep what's mine. You've turned Oliver against me. What would you call that behavior, Brandon?" "I'd call it being honest about our family's financial situation." Brandon stepped closer, his voice dropping to something more intense. "Mom, Oliver is drowning in debt. He can barely afford to eat some weeks because all his money goes to loan payments. You have the power to help him, and you're refusing out of, what? Pride? Stubbornness? Self-preservation," I said. "That money is my retirement security. I'm 70 years old, Brandon. I can't work forever. What happens when I can't work anymore? Where do I live? How do I pay my bills?" "You could live with me and Sienna," Brandon said, and the offer sounded about as appealing as a root canal. "We have plenty of space in the penthouse. You wouldn't have to worry about rent or expenses." The thought of living under Sienna's roof, subject to her judgment and control, made my skin crawl. "That's not going to happen." "Then what is your plan, Mom? Work yourself to death on hospital floors until you physically can't anymore, then what? Live on Social Security in this depressing apartment until you die alone?" The cruelty of that statement, the way he wielded my age and mortality as weapons, made me flinch. But it also steeled my resolve. "My plan," I said carefully, "is none of your concern. That house is mine. The money from selling it will be mine. And what I do with it is my decision and mine alone." Brandon stared at me for a long moment, and I watched something in his face harden. "You're really going to do this? You're really going to be this selfish?" "If taking care of myself is selfish, then yes, I am." "Fine." Brandon turned to leave, then paused and looked back at me. "But don't come crying to me when you've blown through that money and you're broke and alone. Don't expect Oliver or me to bail you out when your pride has cost you everything." He left, and I stood in the hallway for several minutes, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get my key in the lock. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Brandon's words echoing in my head. Broke and alone. Pride costing me everything. Was I making a mistake? Was I being stubborn and foolish, as he claimed? But then I thought about the way Sienna had looked at my apartment with barely concealed disgust. The way Brandon had calculated my remaining life expectancy like I was a depreciating asset. The way Oliver had called me selfish for wanting to keep what was mine. No. I wasn't being foolish. I was finally, after 70 years, putting myself first. The next morning, I called the real estate agent back. "I want to list the house as soon as possible," I told her. "And I want this sale to move quickly." "Wonderful," she said. "The market is very hot right now for Victorian properties. I think we can have you in contract within a month, closed within 60 days. 60 days. In 2 months, I would have access to approximately $750,000, minus selling costs and fees. Probably around $700,000 when everything was said and done. $700,000. More money than I'd ever had in my entire life. The possibilities began to unfold in my mind. I could buy a small condo outright, no mortgage. I could finally retire from nursing. I could travel. Patricia's suggestion from the cafeteria came back to me. I could see the world. I spent my lunch break that day at the hospital not eating, but researching. I pulled up travel websites on my phone, browsing through images of places I'd only dreamed about. The Amalfi Coast in Italy. The temples of Kyoto, Japan. The Northern Lights in Norway. The Greek Islands. New Zealand's South Island. The Great Barrier Reef in Australia. And then I saw it. An advertisement for a world cruise. Circle the globe in 120 days, the headline read. Visit 6 continents, 35 countries, and 60 ports of call. Experience the journey of a lifetime. I clicked on the link, my heart racing. The cruise departed from Los Angeles in April, just 3 months away, and traveled across the Pacific to Asia, through the Suez Canal to the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic to South America, then back to California. 4 months circling the entire planet. The price made me gasp. $85,000 for a solo ocean view stateroom. But then I thought, why not? For the first time in my life, I would have the money. For the first time in my life, I had no one depending on me, no obligations holding me back. I was 70 years old. How many more chances would I have to do something like this? I clicked on the booking information and saved it to my phone. Over the next 2 weeks, the house in Olympia got multiple offers. The real estate agent called me excitedly to report that we had 5 buyers competing, driving the price up. We ended up accepting an offer for $795,000, $15,000 over asking price. I was sitting in my apartment when I signed the electronic documents accepting the offer, and I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Sadness for losing the last physical connection to Aunt Cecilia, who'd been kind to me my whole life. Relief that the financial pressure would soon be resolved. And excitement, genuine, bubbling excitement, about what this money could mean for my future. I didn't tell Brandon about the accepted offer. I didn't tell Oliver. As far as I was concerned, this was my business and mine alone. But word got out anyway. Small towns talk, and Olympia was no exception. Someone who knew Brandon mentioned seeing the sold sign go up on Aunt Cecilia's property. Brandon called me at 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after our confrontation in the hallway. You sold it, he said without preamble when I answered groggily. You actually sold the house without even telling me. Good morning to you too, Brandon. Don't good morning me, Mom. When were you planning to mention that you'd sold a $800,000 property? When were you going to discuss how to invest that money properly? I wasn't, I said, coming fully awake now. Because it's not your money to invest. I'm your son. I'm your family. You owe me at least a conversation about this. I owe you? I sat up in bed, anger flaring hot in my chest. Brandon, I owe you nothing. I gave you everything I had for 39 years. I worked myself to exhaustion to provide for you. I sacrificed my entire adult life to give you opportunities. The debt between us, if there is one, is paid in full. So what are you going to do with the money? Brandon demanded. Blow it on stupid purchases? Give it all to Rachel out of spite? What I do with my money is none of your concern. Oliver is your grandson. He's drowning in student debt. How can you? Oliver called me selfish to my face, I interrupted. He stood in my living room and told me I was choosing money over family. He's an adult, Brandon. He took out those loans knowing he'd have to pay them back. That's not my responsibility. You're unbelievable, Brandon said, his voice rising. You're actually going to let your own grandson suffer when you could help him with the snap of your fingers. I'm going to let my grandson learn the same lesson I had to learn, I said firmly. That you work hard, you pay your debts, and you don't expect other people to bail you out just because you're family. Brandon made a sound of pure frustration. When you're old and sick and you need help, don't come running to us. Don't expect Oliver or me to take care of you when you've made it clear that you care more about money than your own family. I'll keep that in mind, I said, and hung up. My hands were shaking, but I felt oddly empowered. For the first time in my life, I'd stood up to my son without backing down, without apologizing, without trying to smooth things over to keep the peace. It felt good. The house closed escrow in mid-March, exactly 8 weeks after we'd accepted the offer. After all the fees, commissions, and taxes were paid, $742,000 was deposited into my checking account. I sat at my computer, staring at my bank balance. $742,000. More money than I'd earned in the last 15 years of working combined. The first thing I did was call the cruise line and book that world cruise. $85,000, paid in full. The departure date was April 12th, less than a month away. The second thing I did was give my notice at Mercy General Hospital. 2 weeks. After 50 years of nursing, I was retiring. Patricia threw me a small retirement party in the break room. There was sheet cake from the grocery store and cheap champagne in plastic cups, but it was perfect. My colleagues, some I'd worked with for decades, hugged me and wished me well and told me I deserved this. "What are you going to do with all your free time?" asked Marcus, one of the younger nurses. "I'm taking a cruise," I said. "A world cruise." 4 months. The room erupted in excited chatter. Everyone wanted to know where I was going, what ports I'd visit, how I'd managed to save up for such an extravagant trip. I told them about inheriting the house, about selling it, about deciding to do something for myself for the first time in my life. I didn't mention Brandon or Oliver or the family conflict. That was private, painful. But as I was leaving the hospital for the last time, my locker cleaned out and my badge turned in, Patricia pulled me aside. "Does your son know about the cruise?" she asked quietly. "No," I admitted. "And I'm not planning to tell him." Patricia nodded slowly. "He's going to find out eventually." "Let him," I said. "By the time he does, I'll be halfway across the Pacific Ocean, and there won't be anything he can do about it." But I underestimated how quickly word would spread. And I underestimated just how far Brandon would go when he found out what I'd done with his inheritance money. The explosion came 3 days before I was scheduled to leave for Los Angeles to board the cruise ship. I was packing, sorting through clothes, buying new luggage, feeling genuinely excited for the first time in years, when someone began pounding on my apartment door. Not knocking. Pounding. I opened it to find Brandon standing there, his face purple with rage, with Sienna right behind him looking equally furious. "A cruise?" Brandon roared before I could even say hello. "You spent $85,000 on a fucking cruise?" He shoved past me into my apartment, Sienna following. I'd never seen my son this angry, not even during his worst moments with Rachel. "Brandon, lower your voice," I said, aware that my neighbors could probably hear him through the thin walls. Lower my voice? Lower my voice? He was practically screaming now. "You sold an $800,000 house, and instead of helping your grandson, instead of securing your own future, you blew $85,000 on a vacation? Are you out of your mind?" "It's my money," I said, trying to stay calm. "And I can spend it however I want." "On what? 4 months of shuffleboard and buffets with other entitled senior citizens?" Sienna's voice was sharp as a blade. "Do you have any idea how selfish this is? Oliver is drowning in debt, and you're going to sail around the world eating lobster and drinking champagne?" "Oliver's debt is not my responsibility," I said firmly. "He's your grandson." Brandon grabbed a cruise brochure I'd left on my coffee table, the one showing the ship and itinerary. "Look at this. Private balcony. Premium dining. Shore excursions. You're living like a queen while your own family suffers." "Your family isn't suffering, Brandon. You drive a Tesla. You live in a penthouse. Sienna's wearing a coat that costs more than some people make in a month. You're not suffering. You're just angry that you can't control my money. We could have tripled this money. Brandon threw the brochure across the room. I could have invested it properly, and in 5 years you'd have over $2 million. Instead, you're pissing it away on a cruise that'll be over in 4 months, and then what? Then you'll have nothing. I'll have the rest of my money, I said. About $650,000 after the cruise, which is more than enough for me to buy a small condo and live comfortably for the rest of my life. $650,000 won't last as long as you think, especially at your age with medical expenses, Sienna interjected. You're being incredibly short-sighted, Eleanor. This cruise is a vanity project, a way for you to pretend you're something you're not. And what am I not? I asked coldly. Rich, Sienna said bluntly. You're not rich, Eleanor. You're a retired nurse with a one-time windfall. Rich people can afford world cruises. You can't. You're playing dress-up with money you can't afford to waste. The classism dripping from her words made my blood boil. Get out of my apartment. Not until you cancel this ridiculous cruise, Brandon said. Mom, I'm asking you, begging you, to think about this rationally. Cancel the cruise, get your money back, and let me help you invest it properly. For Oliver's sake if not for your own. No. Mom. I said no, Brandon. I'm taking this cruise. I'm doing something for myself for the first time in 70 years, and I'm not going to let you guilt me out of it. Brandon stared at me, and I watched something in his face shift. The anger receded slightly, replaced by calculation. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more controlled. You're going to regret this, Mom. You're going to come back from this cruise in 4 months, and you're going to realize you wasted $85,000 on nothing. And when you do, when you're sitting in this depressing apartment counting your remaining money and realizing how quickly it's disappearing, don't come to me for help. Don't expect me to bail you out. I won't, I said. Sienna laughed, the sound cold and mocking. You say that now. But when you run out of money in a few years, you'll come crawling back, expecting Brandon to take care of you. That's what mothers like you always do. You manipulate your children with guilt and then expect them to rescue you from your own bad decisions. Mothers like me? I repeated slowly. Please, Sienna, tell me more about what kind of mother I am. You who've never raised a child, who convinced my son to abandon his wife and son, who stands in my home insulting me. Tell me all about motherhood. Sienna's face flushed red. At least I'm not selfish enough to waste my family's inheritance on. It's not the family's inheritance. I shouted, finally losing my composure. It's mine. My aunt left that house to me, not to Brandon, not to Oliver, to me. And I earned the right to spend that money however I damn well please. The apartment fell silent. I was breathing hard, my heart racing. Brandon and Sienna stared at me like I'd slapped them. Get out, I said quietly. Get out of my home and don't come back. They left, but Sienna paused in the doorway. You're going to die alone, Eleanor. That's what happens to selfish people. They die alone and forgotten, and no one mourns them. The door slammed behind them. I stood in my living room, surrounded by half-packed luggage and cruise brochures, and I felt tears running down my face. Not tears of sadness or regret, but tears of anger and frustration and something that felt almost like grief. My son was gone. The boy I'd raised, the man I'd sacrificed everything for, was completely gone, replaced by this entitled stranger who saw me as nothing but an obstacle to money he felt he deserved. But I wasn't going to let him ruin this for me. I wasn't going to let his anger and manipulation steal my joy. I wiped my tears, returned to my packing, and began planning for my departure. 3 days later, I took an Uber to the airport, flew to Los Angeles, and boarded the Ocean Meridian, the luxury cruise ship that would be my home for the next 4 months. As the ship pulled away from the dock and Los Angeles receded into the distance, I stood on my private balcony watching America disappear behind me, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. But what I didn't know yet was that my journey, and my revenge, was only beginning. The lessons my son and grandson were about to learn would be far more expensive than they could have imagined. And it would all start with a phone call I'd received somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The first 2 weeks aboard the Ocean Meridian were like living in a dream I'd never dared to have. The ship itself was magnificent, 12 decks of polished wood, brass fixtures, and marble floors. My stateroom, while not the largest on the ship, had a private balcony where I could sit with my morning coffee and watch the endless Pacific Ocean roll past. The other passengers were a mix of ages and backgrounds, though many were retirees like myself who'd saved for years, or in my case, finally had the means, to take this journey of a lifetime. I made friends quickly. There was Dorothy and Harold, a couple from Connecticut celebrating their 50th anniversary. There was James, a widower from Australia who'd promised his late wife he'd take this cruise in her memory. There was Yuki, a Japanese woman my age who'd retired from teaching and decided to see the world before she got too old to enjoy it. We ate together in the dining room most evenings, sharing stories and laughter over meals that were better than anything I'd ever tasted. We attended onboard lectures about the ports we'd be visiting. We played trivia games, watched movies under the stars, and slowly became a little family of sorts. For the first time in decades, I wasn't someone's mother or grandmother or employee. I was just Eleanor. I was just myself. Our first port was Hawaii, 5 days at sea before we arrived in Honolulu. I'd never been to Hawaii, never been anywhere really except Seattle and a handful of nursing conferences over the years. Walking through Waikiki, feeling the warm sun on my face and the ocean breeze in my hair, I felt tears prick my eyes. This was what I'd been missing. This was what I'd sacrificed for 50 years. From Hawaii, we sailed to French Polynesia. Bora Bora was like something from a postcard, turquoise water so clear you could see fish swimming 30 feet below, white sand beaches, mountains rising dramatically from the sea. I went snorkeling for the first time in my life and floated above coral reefs teeming with colorful fish, feeling weightless and young and completely, utterly happy. In Tahiti, I bought a pearl necklace from a local artisan, something beautiful and completely impractical. The old Eleanor would never have spent $200 on jewelry. But the new Eleanor, the woman who'd finally learned to put herself first, bought it without hesitation and wore it to dinner that night, feeling elegant and worthy. We crossed the international date line. We celebrated Easter at sea with a special brunch and an egg hunt that even the elderly passengers participated in with childlike enthusiasm. We watched the sun set over the Pacific more times than I could count, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple that seemed too beautiful to be real. I thought about Brandon and Oliver sometimes, but less and less as the days passed. Out here on the ocean, thousands of miles from Seattle, their anger and entitlement felt small and distant. I'd made the right choice. I knew it in my bones. We arrived in Auckland, New Zealand on day 23 of the cruise. It was a beautiful city, nestled between harbors with volcanic hills rising all around. I signed up for a shore excursion to Hobbiton, the movie set from Lord of the Rings, and spent the day wandering through the Shire, marveling at the artistry and whimsy of it all. That evening, back on the ship, I was getting ready for dinner when my phone rang. I'd been keeping it turned off for most of the cruise, enjoying the disconnection from my regular life, but I'd turned it on in port to check my email and had forgotten to turn it back off. The caller ID showed a Seattle number I didn't recognize. Hello? Mrs. Whitfield? Eleanor Whitfield? Yes, speaking. This is Catherine Morrison from Seattle First Bank. I'm calling about some unusual activity on your checking account. Do you have a few minutes to discuss some concerns? My stomach clenched. What kind of unusual activity? Well, we've noticed several large transfer attempts from your account over the past week. They were all flagged by our fraud detection system and blocked, but I wanted to reach out to confirm that you didn't authorize these transfers. I definitely didn't authorize any transfers, I said, my heart starting to race. How large are we talking about? The attempts were for $50,000, $75,000, and most recently, $100,000. All 3 attempts were made to transfer funds to an account belonging to a Brandon Whitfield. The attempts originated from your online banking portal using your login credentials. I sat down heavily on my bed, my legs suddenly weak. Brandon Whitfield is my son. I see. Catherine's voice became more careful. Mrs. Whitfield, do you share your online banking credentials with your son? Absolutely not, I said firmly. I've never given him access to my accounts. Then I'm afraid we're looking at a case of identity theft and attempted fraud. Someone has your login information and has been attempting to transfer substantial amounts of money out of your account. Fortunately, the amounts triggered our automatic fraud alerts, so no money was actually transferred. But Mrs. Whitfield, we need to secure your accounts immediately. I spent the next hour on the phone with Catherine, changing all my passwords, setting up additional security measures, and filing a formal fraud report. My hands shook the entire time. Brandon had tried to steal from me. My own son had somehow gotten my banking information and attempted to transfer over $200,000 out of my account without my knowledge or permission. After I hung up with the bank, I sat on my balcony in the dark, watching the lights of Auckland twinkle in the distance, and I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. This wasn't just about entitlement anymore. This wasn't just my son thinking he deserved my inheritance. This was actual theft. This was criminal. I needed to know more. I needed to understand what was really going on. The next morning, I called Rachel. My former daughter-in-law answered on the 3rd ring, sounding surprised to hear from me. Eleanor? Is everything okay? Where are you calling from? I'm on a cruise, I said. In New Zealand, actually. Rachel, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. How bad is Brandon's financial situation? Really? There was a long pause. What do you mean? The bank called me yesterday. Brandon tried to transfer money out of my account without my permission. Large amounts, over $200,000 total. They blocked the transfers, but Rachel, he was trying to steal from me. Why would he do that if his finances are as stable as he claims? Rachel let out a long breath. Oh, Eleanor. I didn't want to tell you this. I didn't want to worry you, but Brandon is in serious financial trouble. What kind of trouble? The kind where he's about to lose everything, Rachel said quietly. That penthouse he's renting? He's 3 months behind on rent. The Tesla? Leased, and he hasn't made a payment in 2 months. The expensive suits, the fancy dinners, the trips with Sienna, it's all on credit cards that are maxed out. Eleanor, I think he owes close to $400,000. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. $400,000? How is that possible? He's a successful attorney. He was a successful attorney, Rachel corrected. But about a year ago, he made some bad investments, cryptocurrency, I think, based on advice from some of Sienna's friends who claimed to be financial gurus. He lost almost $200,000. Then he started borrowing money to cover the losses, thinking he could make it back. But he just kept losing more. Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't anyone tell me? Because he's ashamed, Rachel said. And because he's been counting on getting your inheritance money to dig himself out of the hole. Eleanor, when he found out you were selling Aunt Cecilia's house, he told Oliver that money was going to save them. He promised Oliver he'd pay off all his student loans once you handed over the inheritance. That's why Oliver was so angry with you. Brandon had been making promises he had no way of keeping unless you gave him your money. Everything clicked into place. The pressure. The manipulation. The anger when I refused to comply. Brandon hadn't just wanted my money, he desperately needed it to avoid financial ruin. And Sienna? I asked. Does she know about all this? Rachel laughed bitterly. Sienna is part of the problem. She's expensive, Eleanor. The clothes, the lifestyle, the constant need to appear wealthy and successful, it's costing Brandon a fortune he doesn't have. But he can't admit to her that he's broke because she'd leave him in a heartbeat. So he keeps pretending, keep spending money he doesn't have, and the hole gets deeper. What about Oliver's student loans? How bad are they really? About $80,000, which is bad but not as catastrophic as Brandon made it sound. Oliver could manage them with income-based repayment plans. But Brandon convinced him that you should just pay them off, that you were being selfish by not helping. I think Brandon wanted to use Oliver's debt to manipulate you into handing over more money than just the loans would require. I closed my eyes, feeling sick. So my son and grandson have been lying to me, manipulating me, trying to guilt me into giving them money that Brandon planned to use to cover his own debts and fund his lifestyle with his mistress. I'm so sorry, Eleanor, Rachel said softly. I thought about warning you, but I didn't want to get in the middle of it. Brandon and I barely speak except when it concerns Oliver. But when you told me about the cruise, I was so happy for you. You deserve to do something for yourself after everything you've sacrificed. After I hung up with Rachel, I sat on my balcony for a long time, watching the ocean and thinking. Brandon had tried to steal from me. He'd attempted to access my bank accounts and transfer out hundreds of thousands of dollars without my knowledge or consent. If the bank's fraud detection hadn't caught it, I would have returned from my cruise to find my accounts drained. And Oliver, my sweet grandson who I'd loved since the day he was born, had been complicit in the manipulation. Maybe he didn't know about Brandon's attempted theft, but he'd known about the pressure campaign. He'd participated in it. He'd called me selfish to my face because his father had convinced him I was the obstacle to his financial freedom. I felt betrayed in a way I'd never experienced before. But I also felt something else, a cold determination to make sure they faced consequences for what they'd done. Over the next few days, as the ship sailed from New Zealand to Australia, I made plans. I called my bank and upgraded all my security measures. I called a lawyer in Seattle, not Brandon's firm, obviously, but a different attorney who specialized in elder law and financial exploitation, and explained the situation. I filed a formal police report about the attempted theft. And then I did something that felt both scary and empowering. I documented everything. I saved all the text messages where Brandon had pressured me about the inheritance. I saved the voicemails. I wrote down detailed notes about every conversation, every manipulation, every guilt trip. I asked Rachel to send me any relevant information she had about Brandon's financial situation. I was building a case. Not necessarily to send my son to jail. I wasn't sure I could do that, despite everything, but to protect myself and make sure he could never access my money again. The cruise continued. We spent 4 days in Sydney, where I climbed the harbour bridge with James and Dorothy, all of us harnessed and scared and laughing as we reached the top and looked out over one of the most beautiful cities I'd ever seen. We visited the Great Barrier Reef and I went scuba diving for the first time, descending into an underwater world of such color and life that I cried into my regulator. We sailed through Southeast Asia, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam. Each port brought new wonders, new experiences, new reminders that the world was so much bigger and more beautiful than the small, anxious life I'd been living in Seattle. But throughout it all, I was preparing. Planning. Getting ready for the confrontation I knew was coming. We were somewhere in the Indian Ocean, about halfway through the cruise, when I got a message from the lawyer I'd hired. Brandon had been formally notified of the fraud investigation. He'd also been served with a cease and desist letter warning him against any further attempts to access my finances or contact me to pressure me about money. The lawyer said Brandon had tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, that he'd been given permission to access my accounts. But when they'd shown him the bank's evidence, the timestamps of the login attempts, the fact that they'd originated from his IP address, the pattern of escalating transfer amounts, he'd stopped talking and hired his own attorney. Mrs. Whitfield, my lawyer said during our call, you have a very strong case here. This is clear-cut attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person. If you wanted to press criminal charges, the prosecutor would likely pursue it. I don't know if I want that, I admitted. He's still my son. I understand. But at minimum, I'd recommend getting a restraining order that prevents him from contacting you about financial matters. And you should seriously consider removing him from any beneficiary designations you might have. That last part hit me hard. Brandon had always been the sole beneficiary of my life insurance policy, my retirement accounts, everything. It had never occurred to me to change that, even after everything that had happened. But now I wasn't sure I wanted Brandon to inherit anything from me. "I'll think about it," I told the lawyer. The ship sailed on. We went through the Suez Canal, that narrow ribbon of water cutting through Egypt, connecting the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. We visited Dubai, where the wealth on display was almost obscene: artificial islands, buildings so tall they seemed to pierce the sky, luxury beyond anything I'd ever imagined. We spent a week cruising through the Greek islands: Santorini with its white buildings and blue domes, Mykonos with its windmills and beaches, Crete with its ancient ruins. I bought olive oil and honey from local farmers. I ate fresh seafood caught that morning. I drank wine that tasted like sunshine and laughed with my new friends until my sides hurt. In Rome, I visited the Colosseum and the Vatican. I threw a coin in the Trevi Fountain and made a wish, not for money or reconciliation with Brandon, but simply for more days like these. More joy. More life. We sailed along the coast of Spain and Portugal. We crossed the Atlantic, spending a week at sea with nothing but ocean in every direction, and I found peace in the endless horizon. In the Caribbean, we island hopped through paradise: white sand beaches, crystal clear water, tropical drinks with umbrellas that made me feel young and carefree. We sailed through the Panama Canal, that engineering marvel cutting through Central America, and I marveled at human ingenuity and ambition. And finally, after 120 days at sea, after visiting 35 countries and experiencing more in 4 months than I had in 70 years, we sailed back into Los Angeles harbor. I stood on my balcony as we approached the port, watching America come into view, and I felt different. Stronger. More certain of who I was and what I deserved. The woman who'd boarded this ship in April had been afraid of her son's anger, afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of being selfish. The woman disembarking in August had no such fears. I took an Uber from the port directly to the airport and caught a flight back to Seattle. It was time to face whatever consequences awaited me. But more importantly, it was time to make sure Brandon and Oliver faced their consequences too. I arrived at my apartment late in the evening, jet-lagged and exhausted but filled with purpose. The space looked exactly as I'd left it, but it felt different somehow. Smaller. Less like home and more like a waiting room for a life I no longer wanted to live. The next morning, I woke up early and started making calls. First to my lawyer, letting him know I was back and ready to move forward. Then to the bank, confirming that all my security measures were still in place. And finally, the call I'd been planning for weeks. I called Brandon. He answered on the second ring, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Mom. You're back." "I am. I'd like to meet with you. And Oliver. And Sienna. Today, if possible." "To apologize?" Brandon asked, hope creeping into his voice. "Mom, if you're calling to say you realize you made a mistake." "I'm calling to say we need to have a conversation," I interrupted. "A conversation that's long overdue. Can you meet me at my apartment at 2 p.m.? There was a pause. "Will you be alone?" "My lawyer will be present," I said. "This is a legal matter now, Brandon." "Jesus, Mom. You're really doing this? You're really treating your own son like a criminal?" "You tried to steal $225,000 from my bank account," I said calmly. "That makes you a criminal whether I treat you like one or not." 2 p.m. Don't be late." I hung up before he could respond. My lawyer, Thomas Chin, arrived at 1:30 p.m. to prepare. He was a sharp, efficient man in his 50s who specialized in elder law and had seen countless cases of family members exploiting elderly relatives. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked as we arranged chairs in my small living room. "We could handle this entirely through legal channels without you having to face them." "I'm sure," I said. "They need to hear this from me." At exactly 2 p.m., there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Brandon, Sienna, and Oliver standing in the hallway. Brandon looked thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes. Sienna's designer perfection seemed slightly frayed around the edges. Oliver wouldn't meet my gaze. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. They filed into my apartment, their eyes immediately going to Thomas, who stood beside my small dining table with a briefcase full of documents. "What is this?" Brandon demanded. "Who is he?" "This is Thomas Chen, my attorney," I said calmly. "Please, sit down. We have a lot to discuss." They sat reluctantly on my sofa, the three of them bunched together like defendants in a courtroom. I took the chair opposite them, with Thomas standing slightly behind me. "Mom, if this is about the bank thing," Brandon started, "that was a misunderstanding. I thought you'd given me access to help manage." "Stop," I said firmly. "No more lies, Brandon. No more manipulation. I know everything." I watched my son's face pale. "I know about your debt," I continued. "About the $400,000 you owe in bad investments and credit cards. I know about the cryptocurrency losses. I know that you're 3 months behind on your rent and about to be evicted from that penthouse. I know the Tesla is being repossessed. I know that everything, the lifestyle, the appearances, the promises you made to Oliver, all of it was built on credit you couldn't afford and money you didn't have." Sienna shifted uncomfortably. Oliver stared at his hands. "I also know that you tried to steal from me," I said, looking directly at Brandon. "Not once, but 3 times. You attempted to transfer over $200,000 out of my bank account without my knowledge or permission. That's not a misunderstanding, Brandon. That's theft. That's financial exploitation of an elderly person. That's a felony." "I was desperate," Brandon said, his voice breaking. "Mom, I was drowning. I thought if I could just access some of the money, just enough to get caught up on my debts, I could pay you back later." "With what?" I asked. "You have no money, Brandon. You have negative money. You were going to steal from me to fund a lifestyle you can't afford and pay debts you've been lying about. And you were going to do it without even asking me, without giving me a choice. You'd already said no." Brandon's voice rose. "You refused to help your own son even though you had hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in your account doing nothing. What was I supposed to do?" "You were supposed to accept my decision," I said. "You were supposed to respect that it was my money, not yours. You were supposed to be an adult and face the consequences of your own choices instead of trying to steal from your elderly mother." Sienna finally spoke up, her voice lacking its usual confidence. "Eleanor, I think you're being unnecessarily harsh. Brandon made some mistakes, yes, but he's your son. Surely you can find it in your heart to help him." "Help him?" I turned to look at her. "Sienna, you've been part of this problem from the beginning. You convinced Brandon to leave his wife and son. You encouraged a lifestyle neither of you could afford. You stood in this apartment and called me selfish for not funding your expensive tastes. You have no standing here. You're not family. You're a woman who saw my son as a meal ticket and has been helping him spend money he didn't have." Sienna's face flushed red, but she didn't respond. I turned to Oliver, who still hadn't looked up. "And you, Oliver. My grandson. The boy I loved from the day you were born. You let your father turn you against me. You called me selfish for wanting to keep my own inheritance. You participated in pressuring me to hand over money that wasn't yours." "I'm sorry, Nana," Oliver whispered, tears running down his face. "I didn't know about Dad's debts. He told me the money was to help me, to pay off my student loans. I didn't know he was lying." "But you knew it was wrong to pressure me," I said gently. "You knew I'd worked my whole life for that money. And you did it anyway because it was easier to see me as an obstacle than to accept that your father's financial problems weren't my responsibility to fix." Oliver nodded, wiping his face with his sleeve. I stood up and walked to where Thomas stood. He handed me a folder of documents. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, turning back to face them. "First, Brandon, you're being removed as beneficiary from all my accounts. When I die, whatever I have left will go to charity. You will inherit nothing from me. Brandon's face went white. Mom. Second, I continued, I've filed a police report about the attempted theft. My lawyer has advised me that I have a strong case for criminal charges. I've decided not to press charges on one condition: you sign this agreement. I pulled out a document and placed it on the coffee table. This is a legally binding agreement stating that you will never again attempt to access my finances, pressure me about money, or contact me regarding my inheritance or assets. If you violate this agreement in any way, I will immediately pursue criminal charges and you will go to jail. Do you understand? Brandon stared at the document like it was a snake. You're really going to do this, he said hoarsely. You're really going to cut me out of your life over money? No, I said quietly. I'm cutting you out of my finances. Whether you're in my life or not is up to you. But Brandon, you need to understand something. I worked for 50 years. I sacrificed everything for you. I gave up relationships, opportunities, my own happiness, all so you could have a better life. And when I finally had something of my own, you tried to take it from me. I felt tears building but blinked them back. You didn't just want the money, Brandon. You felt entitled to it. You thought because you were my son, because I'd always given you everything before, that you deserved my inheritance more than I did. And that's what breaks my heart. Not the attempted theft, but the fact that you see your own mother as nothing more than an ATM machine. The room was silent except for the sound of Oliver's quiet crying. Sign the agreement, I said. Or I press charges. Those are your only options. Brandon looked at Sienna, who shrugged helplessly. Then he looked at Oliver, who was still staring at his hands. Finally, he reached forward and picked up the pen Thomas offered. He signed the document. Oliver, I said, turning to my grandson. I'm not holding you to the same agreement because I believe you were manipulated by your father. But I need you to understand something. Your student loans are your responsibility. I will not be paying them off. However, if you want to rebuild our relationship, if you want to be my grandson again instead of someone who sees me as a source of money, then I'm willing to try. Oliver looked up at me, his face red and tear-stained. I do, Nana. I'm so sorry. I was stupid and selfish and I let Dad convince me that you owed us something. But you didn't. You don't. I'm so sorry. I walked over to him and put my hand on his shoulder. Then we'll work on it. Together. But Oliver, you need to distance yourself from your father's financial problems. You need to make your own way. Can you do that? He nodded vigorously. Yes. I promise. I turned back to Brandon and Sienna, who were standing now, preparing to leave. One more thing, I said. I spent $85,000 on that world cruise. Best money I ever spent. I saw 35 countries. I swam with sea turtles in the Great Barrier Reef. I watched the sun rise over Mount Fuji. I ate fresh pasta in Rome and drank wine in the Greek islands. I made friends and memories that I'll treasure for the rest of my life. I smiled, and I knew it wasn't a kind smile. I have about $650,000 left. I'm going to buy a small condo, already have one picked out, actually. A beautiful 2-bedroom place with a view of Puget Sound. After that, I'll have about $450,000 left, which will be more than enough for me to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I paused, making sure Brandon was listening. And who knows? Maybe I'll take another cruise. Maybe I'll go to Antarctica, or safari in Africa, or tour South America. Maybe I'll spend every last penny on experiences and joy and living the life I denied myself for 70 years. And you know what? I won't feel guilty about it for a single second. Brandon's jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. You're really going to waste all that money? It's not a waste, I interrupted. It's my life, Brandon. Finally, after 7 decades of putting everyone else first, it's my life. And I'm going to live it exactly how I want to. Thomas handed Brandon a copy of the signed agreement. You should go now, he said professionally. And Mr. Whitfield, I'd strongly advise you to honor this agreement. Mrs. Whitfield has been more than generous by not pressing charges. Don't make her regret that decision. Brandon and Sienna left without another word, but at the door, Brandon turned back one last time. I hope it was worth it, Mom, he said bitterly. I hope your cruises and your freedom and your precious independence were worth losing your son. I looked at him, really looked at him, this stranger wearing my son's face, and I felt something inside me finally let go. The guilt, the obligation, the desperate need for his approval and love. You know what, Brandon? I said softly. It was. It absolutely was. He left, slamming the door behind him. Oliver stayed. He stayed while Thomas packed up his briefcase and left. He stayed while I made tea in my small kitchen. He stayed while I told him about the cruise, about the places I'd seen and the things I'd experienced, about finally learning what it felt like to live for myself. I want that someday, Nana, he said quietly. Not the money or the cruises necessarily, but that freedom. That confidence. I want to be someone who doesn't need to take from others to feel successful. Then start now, I told him. Make a plan for your student loans. Get on an income-based repayment program. Work hard. Build your own life, not the life your father thinks you should have. And Oliver? Don't wait until you're 70 to start living for yourself. Learn that lesson now. He hugged me before he left, and it felt real in a way our interactions hadn't felt in months. Like maybe, just maybe, I hadn't lost my grandson after all. That night, I stood on the small balcony of my apartment, looking out over Seattle, and I thought about the future. Tomorrow, I'd go look at that condo I'd found, the one with the view of Puget Sound and enough space for me to finally live comfortably. I'd start planning my next adventure, maybe that Antarctica cruise, or perhaps a river cruise through Europe. I'd begin the next chapter of my life. The chapter where I wasn't defined by being someone's mother or someone's employee, but by being Eleanor, just Eleanor, and where that was more than enough. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was Patricia, my friend from the hospital. Welcome home. Coffee tomorrow? I want to hear everything about the cruise. I smiled and typed back, absolutely. And Patricia? Thank you for suggesting I travel. It changed my life. Because it had. Not just the cruise itself, but the decision to finally, after 70 years of sacrifice and service, put myself first. To claim my inheritance not as a family resource to be distributed according to everyone else's needs, but as mine, earned through a lifetime of hard work and deserving of being spent on my own happiness. Brandon had called me selfish. Sienna had said I'd die alone and unmourned. Oliver had accused me of choosing money over family. But as I stood there in the gathering darkness, feeling the cool Seattle breeze on my face and thinking about all the places I'd seen and all the places I still wanted to go, I realized something important. They were wrong. I hadn't chosen money over family. I'd chosen myself over people who only valued me for what I could give them. I'd chosen dignity over manipulation. I'd chosen freedom over guilt. And if that made me selfish, then I was proud to be selfish. Because for the first time in my life, I was truly, completely, unapologetically free. And I was going to spend whatever time I had left, whether that was 5 years or 25 years, living every single day for myself. My son had laughed when I sold my jewelry to survive during the lean years. He'd mocked my modest apartment and my simple life. He'd called me foolish for spending $85,000 on a cruise when I should have been investing in his financial recovery. But he'd stopped laughing when he saw the bank balance after I returned. When he realized that I wasn't broke and desperate as he'd hoped I'd be. When he understood that I had more than enough money to live comfortably without him, and that I was never, ever going to fund his lifestyle or bail him out of the consequences of his own choices. He'd stopped laughing when he realized that his mother, the woman he dismissed as financially naive and easily manipulated, had outsmarted him, protected herself, and was living the life he couldn't afford to live himself. And you know what? I didn't laugh at him when I saw the desperation in his eyes at that final meeting. I didn't mock him for his debt or his failing facade or the empire of appearances he'd built on credit he couldn't repay. But I did smile. Because I'd won. Not by destroying him, but by saving myself. And that, I realized as I turned away from the balcony and went inside to start planning my next adventure, was the sweetest victory of all. The end. Epilogue. 6 months later, Eleanor purchased a beautiful 2-bedroom condo overlooking Puget Sound. She sold most of her old furniture and decorated her new space with treasures from her travels, artwork from Thailand, textiles from Morocco, pottery from Greece. She booked another cruise, this time to Antarctica, departing in 3 months. Oliver visited her regularly, having distanced himself from his father's influence. He was working full-time while attending graduate school part-time, managing his student loans responsibly and building his own life. Brandon and Sienna broke up 4 months after the confrontation, when Sienna finally realized that Brandon's wealth was an illusion he could no longer maintain. He filed for bankruptcy and moved into a modest apartment, selling off his expensive possessions one by one to pay his debts. He never contacted Eleanor again, and she was surprised to discover that the absence of her son from her life wasn't as painful as she'd feared. She'd mourned him long ago, mourned the death of the boy she'd raised and the emergence of the entitled stranger who'd tried to steal from her. Rachel and Eleanor remained close, meeting for coffee every Sunday like they used to, except now Eleanor had stories to share about places she'd been and adventures she'd had. And every night, when Eleanor stood on her balcony looking out at the water and the mountains beyond, she felt nothing but gratitude. Gratitude for the aunt who'd left her the house. Gratitude for having the courage to sell it and use the money for herself. Gratitude for every sunrise she'd watched from the deck of a cruise ship, every new friend she'd made, every experience she'd had. But most of all, gratitude for finally learning the most important lesson of her life. That putting yourself first isn't selfish. It's survival. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is save yourself.